Welcome to Get Naked with Dr. Kate. I'm Dr. Kate Balestrieri, a licensed psychologist and certified sex therapist. But mostly, I'm someone who believes the conversations we avoid are the conversations that can set us free. I founded the practice Modern Intimacy, where my team and I help people make sense of the invisible forces driving their desire, their relationships, and their emotional health. This podcast is for people ready to have a more honest relationship with themselves and everyone else. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's pleasure. So here's your invitation to peel back the layers, to get smarter, to get closer, and to get naked. No pressure, no performance, just the real thing. When a child discloses sexual abuse, our immediate focus rightly goes to the survivor's healing. But what about the parents lying awake in the dark, 2 rooms away, caught between rage, guilt, and the sudden terror of their own touch? Today, I'll be asking a question that no one talks about. What happens to those parents' sex and romantic lives after their child makes a disclosure of sexual abuse? So, content note, today's podcast will talk a little bit about childhood sexual abuse, and if you're not in a headspace to hear it, please feel free to sign out and come back later when maybe you have more bandwidth or interest. Today I'll be speaking with Dr. Imani Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds is one of the sex therapists at Modern Intimacy, and Dr. Reynolds' most resources on child sexual abuse focus on dyads, parent and child or survivor partner conversation. But you've spent the last several years studying that hidden third relationship, the one between the parents and their own sexuality. Your groundbreaking research explores how the trauma of disclosure can reshape parental intimacy, desire, and partnership, from navigating the conflicting grief to reclaiming physical touch without triggering their own shame. Dr. Reynolds, thank you for bringing this vital information and invisible struggle to light. I appreciate you being here and talking about it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Of course. So, what drew you to study how a child's sexual abuse can impact their parents' sexual relationship?
So I was actually drawn to this by real life experience that I had in working with children who had been sexually abused. I actually worked at an agency where I provided therapy to children who had been sexually abused. And one thing that was interesting was that we also provided services to the parents. And the parents typically didn't seek services as much as the kids did, which I thought was interesting in and of itself. But also, the few times when I did have parents who would come and, take advantage of those services and talk about their experiences, it was interesting the things that would come up in those communications with them, and how the fact that a lot of parents weren't taking on that service, in addition to the things that were coming up when I would talk to parents, highlighted that this wasn't something that was focused on. The primary focus was on the kid and not on the parents. And in those conversations, intimacy would come up, desire would come up, and how the parents were experiencing that in their relationships.
It makes so much sense that it wouldn't be a primary topic of parents' goals, right? And when their children are making an outcry. And I wonder how many parents are even thinking about their own relationship to intimacy at that early stage. But after they have some kind of stability, they are helping their child through whatever process their child needs to go through, I imagine that a lot of parents find themselves really curious about their own relationship with sex and probably surprised at how much impact there is there. And I'm curious, why do you think this area of research has been so overlooked?
I think the biggest factor is what we're speaking to about how the kids are the focal point because they're the one who experienced it. As a parent, your initial reaction typically is to focus on the kid, make sure the kid has the support, the help they need. And it's like an underlying thing that parents aren't connecting at first, how it's impacting them. So right away you see, okay, my kid is suffering, they're struggling. I know the step is I need to make sure my kid is okay. In the midst of doing all of that, parents aren't even really thinking about how they're being impacted by it. It's like this invisible thing that's going on. So then at some point, if parents have the ability to kind of slow down or have that insight to be maybe I should get some support for myself, then it might come up through that. But that's typically not the focal point in the beginning.
What do you think might be some of the first things that come up for parents as they're imagining the degree of impact in their lives?
I'm not sure that it comes up very often for them.
Okay.
I'm thinking that because of, like, when I was doing the research that I have been doing over the past couple of years, I had multiple parents who I was conducting the research with tell me that they didn't think about this at all until it came time to, like, they saw the study, decided they were going to participate in the study, and as I'm talking to them, there was a lot of like, whoa, I never thought about this before.
Well, that's so interesting. So it kind of lives in this unconscious space for a lot of parents where they don't necessarily give a lot of attention to the impact on their own sexuality. Now let's back up a second. You did this research as part of your dissertation to complete your doctorate. And so in your research, you were primarily conducting interviews with parents and looking for some of the themes around what felt important to study.
Yeah, so I was conducting interviews with parents. I was specifically asking them questions related to their desire and their intimacy and how they experienced it prior to the disclosure and after the disclosure. And I also asked questions related to secondary traumatic stress because that was a way that helped to be able to understand like how this might have been occurring with the parents, that they were experiencing stress related to the fact that they were going through this with their child even though they hadn't gone through it, and how that stress and the symptoms of PTSD that they were experiencing could contributed to these changes that they were experiencing in their relationship and with their sex lives.
That's really interesting. How did you differentiate between secondary stress and like a vicarious trauma of seeing their child be impacted in this way?
There was a lot of research out there about vicarious trauma,
Mm-hmm.
secondary traumatic stress, different ways of framing it. And typically in the research, when vicarious trauma was talked about, it was talked about a lot with people who work in social services or people who are first responders and like how they experience trauma. And secondary traumatic stress in the research that I found seemed to be more of a broader term to be utilized. It seemed like it was the most fitting and appropriate way to describe what was going on, particularly because a lot of the symptoms that the parents were experiencing were symptoms that people experience when they are experiencing PTSD. So the way secondary traumatic stress has been defined in the research is that it mimics symptoms of PTSD. So I think because the parents were experiencing those symptoms, it was the most fitting way to try to understand what was going on.
Yeah, I wonder how many parents even recognized they were experiencing symptoms that mirrored PTSD of their own. Yeah.
Yeah, probably not a lot.
Probably not. Yeah, they're focused on working with their child and creating stabilization and healing. And I think that's true for so many folks who experience a secondary traumatization. So, in your research, you were really clear in making a distinction between sexual desire and sexual intimacy. Why did you recognize that distinction to be so important in looking at the impact on parents?
I mean, from a conceptualization standpoint, they're both conceptualized in very different ways. And in terms of what was like happening within the parents, desire really came up more in the internal experiences that they were having. Also, that was impacted by external experiences that were going on and like things that were happening in the relationship dynamic. But how the parents experienced it was significantly internal, where rather intimacy was something that really showed up in the relationship dynamics between the two people and like how they communicated with one another, how close they felt to one another, how much they considered one another. So it was different in that lens, and a lot of different things came up by asking questions in both of those capacities.
If I'm hearing you right, sometimes there may have been a discrepancy between what a parent's degree of desire was and whether or not they were being sexual with a partner. Sometimes maybe they had lower desire, but they were still being sexual. Sometimes they had lower desire and they were not, they were being less sexual, maybe sometimes higher desire, and they were more or less sexual with their partner. Is that the distinction?
Yeah, there's that distinction, and then there's also how the relationship, because intimacy is like described as like the communication, trust, emotional consideration. That's how it was defined in the study, and how those things played a role in the parents' desire to act on certain things with their partner, or how attracted they felt to their partner. If their partner was not being emotionally considerate of their needs, not communicating in the way that really like took them into consideration and everything that was happening, they were less likely to experience desire or attraction for their partner.
So, were there any key differences that you found in the research about how parents described their intimacy versus desire and how those things were impacted?
The key difference that really came out was, again, the internal component of desire came out a lot, and how like one big thing that came up was parents' intrusive thoughts that they were experiencing and how that affected their desire. So this didn't have to do with how they were connecting with their partner, but they have their own thoughts and visions, about what had occurred with their child, and that impacted their inability to be able to be sexual with their partner. Different parents talked about experiencing like intrusive thoughts and flashbacks, having certain like fantasies be interrupted that like they once were interested in, and now that fantasy was associated with something they might have heard that had been experienced through the disclosure. So that was something that they couldn't participate anymore because that thought impacted that. And then on the other side of that, parents, when they talked about intimacy with their partners, they talked more about, like, for example, a big thing was how their partner reacted. So parents responded in very different ways to this disclosure. Obviously, one important element of the research was that parents were in a relationship at the time of the disclosure, so I could assess for the changes that occurred before and after. Mm-hmm. And parents typically, or at least in the ones that I talked to, they noticed differences in how their partner responded. And that created a significant challenge in some of the relationship dynamics, because you start to maybe look at your partner a little bit differently for how they're handling things, or maybe one partner is taking on the burden of handling things and like navigating the logistics of what they need to do to support the child in the aftermath, or like noticing the changes that are happening in the relationship, and the other person might be taking more of a backseat. So those things really affected how connected they felt with each other on a relational level, and that created challenges there too.
I appreciate that you highlighted that in your conversations with parents, because it's so common that when a child makes a disclosure of sexual abuse, parents do have different reactions. And in fact, it's probably more common than not for parents to be at different degrees of understanding, acceptance, denial, activation, providing support to the child, to each other. They get very locked up when this happens, and it can create a lot of tension between partners if they, one, disagree on what's happened or what to do about it, and two, don't know how to talk with each other about what they're observing in terms of the impact on their child and within their relationship. So how did trauma-related thoughts or images show up in parents' sexual experiences, especially around desire or fantasy? Were there any themes?
Yeah, I think the biggest theme came up, kind of what I was speaking to before, was the intrusive thoughts. There was a lot of information that came up around that, in particular how parents had some like fantasies or things that they were interested in that were kind of directly related to what their child had experienced, and that now shifted the way that they were able to perceive that, and that was no longer something that had joy attached to it anymore. When you're having those intrusive thoughts come up, it's changing now your ability to be able to enjoy that, to be able to focus on that. And for some, they had to like completely shut that off altogether. So now while they might be interested in a certain sex act that they heard was something that was a part of their child's abuse, now that's something that they could no longer participate in.
Yeah. In the parents that you spoke with, I'm curious how much time had elapsed between when their child made the disclosure and when you were interviewing them on average?
I would say on average, there had been quite a few years that had gone by. If I could put a number to it, I would say maybe like 7 years.
If in your interviews you had any conversation with the parents about maybe the impact earlier, closer to the time of the disclosure, versus, if several years had passed, what, if anything, had changed in terms of their desire or their intimacy or intrusive thoughts or trauma symptoms?
Yeah, that was actually a big theme that came up in the write-up that I did, where I talked about how desire was rebuilt over time. And for some parents, desire did seem like it was rebuilt over time, and then for other parents, it didn't. And some of the things that I noticed was that how the situation was navigated after definitely played a role in if that relationship and the intimacy and the desire, if it kind of went back to how things were before, or if it never recovered. And that looked like if parents had gotten support for their kid, if they had gotten support for themselves, how they described their partner's responses, how they described their communication with their partner, them being like considerate of one another, and they're like going through their own process of everything that happened. And it seemed that parents who didn't maintain like a strong connection with each other and kind of work through this in a way that they like supported one another, or maybe again for some parents it wasn't even something that they had really thought about over the years, then it wasn't really something that rebuilt in the same way as parents who had a different connection with each other, where there was more trust and more connection.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the discrepancies in how parents reacted that might have impacted their desire or connection in the long term?
I would say a big thing that came up was the differences in the type of support that they wanted to get for the child. Like in one of the stories, there was like talks about being having religion be involved, and like the one parent feeling like that was not appropriate and that might further traumatize the child, with the other parent feeling like that was the best route to go. So definitely differences in how they decided they wanted to get help for the kid. And then another one I would think was like which parent was putting in the effort to make sure that the things were navigated logistically. Like the parent who was making sure that the kid got support and kind of like taking on that role of being that person, while the other parent maybe wasn't involved as much.
Yeah, I could imagine that would feel really abandoning to sort of be the only parent, to feel like you're the only parent who's taking an active step toward getting your child the resources and support that they need. And it also brings to mind a question about how do they talk about sharing that labor, and how do they talk about the impact on the parent who's taking on the majority of that labor, because there's a higher degree of risk for secondary traumatization or stress for that parent if they're the one who's primarily managing all of that. In your research, what role did trust play in parents' experiences after the disclosure?
This was a big thing that came up as well, and it showed up in two different ways. So, in one way, it showed up was in the relationship dynamics, and parents like shift in trust in their partner. And the trust wasn't always related to something that the parent did, but it was just like related to the sense of this thing happened. It really like shakes, like your sense of security, your sense of stability. Like even if it didn't happen to you, just knowing that this happens. And the parents challenges with being able to trust sex and be able to trust intimacy and like what that looks like. And now we have all these extra things and layers that are now attached to sex, and I don't know if I trust this to be something that is safe anymore. And then the other way that it showed up was internally, and that some parents described how like it might have shifted how they had trust within themselves, and like how they show up when it comes to sex and their interactions with their partner. Not because like before this wasn't something that they had ever thought about or questioned, are they a safe person for their partner? But now that this thing had happened, and again, the degrees that the kids had experienced the sexual abuse, like they varied, and just understanding that it can happen in degrees of like coerciveness and like manipulation, and like how child sexual abuse may occur, and like, grooming happening, and just like all of these elements of sexual abuse and what we know about that. And then like just starting to like maybe question your own self and like how you're showing up toward your partner, and are you being somebody that's a safe space for your partner.
Feels so big. No parent is really prepared for this to happen, right?
No,
People don't,
not at all.
yeah, they don't generally have children and say, well, this is something I expect will happen, so let's make a blueprint together. So I can imagine it really is jarring for parents and activates so many different kinds of security and safety paradigms within their own minds. I wonder if in your research you had any themes or differentiation come up around impact for parents who they themselves had experienced sexual violence as a child.
It wasn't something that I was able to spend a lot of time like diving into in the research, just because there were so many things that came up based on like the initial questions that I was asking. But that would definitely be something to explore further, because I could only imagine how much of a change that would have occurred, or like how much it would have exasperated what the parents had experienced. I know there was one participant in particular that talked about it, and they kind of talked about like how they could relate to what the experience was, and that contributed to the emotional state that they were in. So we didn't dive too much into like how it impacted things with the desired intimacy, but they did talk about how their emotional state was impacted because they could really relate to what their kid was experiencing, and that made them feel even more empathy.
I can imagine it would bring up a lot for parents. I'm also curious because for childhood sexual abuse, the majority of perpetrating parties are known to the child. And I'm wondering if in your research there was any differentiation discussed with the parents on the impact on the parents based on whether or not the perpetrator of the abuse was known to the family or known to the parent. For example, was it a neighbor, another family member, the child's coach, someone that is in their lives in a more personal way versus someone who maybe doesn't have any ongoing interaction with the family or the child?
So all of that wasn't something that I talked about extensively. It was something that I definitely noticed in some of the parents who did talk about how it was somebody that was known or it was a family member. And I do feel like that was just another focal point in their discussions around what happened. And it added another layer of complexity, especially when talking about how they navigated the situation. And they also had to deal with not only what was going on in their own internal family system, but also if it was another person in the family member, now you're also dealing with how the family has interacted and how that might have caused a divide in the family if people maybe like taking sides or having trouble believing, something like this could have happened, and really shaking up those outside relationships too with people that you once were close with. And that just creates another layer of challenge that the parents is experiencing and the emotional state that they're in while they're trying to navigate this. So it's definitely I could see like a bigger burden.
Yeah, much more, so many more layers to navigate through, and opportunities for partners to stay really protective of their couple bubble and the relationship, and also so many more opportunities to get distracted by competing loyalties with family members, friends, whomever it might be, who was involved in the abuse. So, what do you want clinicians, partners, or families to understand most from your research?
I think the biggest takeaway that I want to come from this research is the acknowledgement of how important this is, and for it to not be something that's so invisible that people are experiencing. I think one, parents are already not at the focal point, which makes sense because the kid experienced it. We need to get the kid help as the caregivers. That's the responsibility to make sure that your kid's okay. But in addition to like the even just acknowledging like the emotional aspect and the stress that they're under, like sex and sexuality and intimacy, like those are also things that are typically put on the back burner even when you haven't experienced a trauma. So now we have additional layers to further suggest that, okay, I need to focus on my own mental health and my kids' mental health. Like, God, I'm not even thinking about sex. I'm not even thinking about my relationship to intimacy and desire, because that's not even important at this time. But I think it's important for people to know that this is important, and like we have so many different parts of us, and it's okay to address all of those parts even when you're in this position where you're having to put all of this support into making sure that your kid is okay. You're also a person, and you also have to be there for your kids, so you have to make sure that you're okay and that your relationship survives this. And a part of your relationship is your sex and your intimacy, and those things should be taken care of too, and that parents shouldn't feel like they need to put those things on the back burner because maybe that's not as important right now as the other things going on.
Yeah, I think I want to just add a couple of thoughts to that, and that all makes sense, right? Sexuality is a part of our holistic lived experience, and I want to emphasize that sometimes parents' relationships don't survive this kind of event
Mm-hmm.
happening, and that's not good or bad, right or wrong, because when parents do really have a wake up call in terms of their position on addressing sexual violence, their positions on so many different things can come to light, and it can reveal incompatibilities, or it can reveal truths about each other that maybe don't feel aligned to move forward with. And when parents feel ready to reevaluate their own relationship with sex and desire, it does feel like an important thing to home in on, because parents get to have a healthy, thriving sex life. And a lot of the parents that I've worked with in this capacity will say things like, I don't know how I get to enjoy sex again when it's created
Mm-hmm.
such a pain point for my child. I feel guilty enjoying sex when I know my child has gone through something so horrific. And I think that's totally valid. And at the same time, it kind of creates this stuck point potentially in a parent's own healing. And it's really important to remember that survivors recalibrate their relationship with sexuality after a sexual violation, whether it happens when they're a child or an adult. And sometimes that recalibration happens at multiple milestones throughout their life, right? Sexual abuse isn't just something that someone heals from and then they're done with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately creeps up in different iterations over the lifespan, and people have, I hate calling it opportunity, that sounds like such a toxic positivity way of looking at it. If we look at our lifespan as something long, we reevaluate many components of early experiences, and this can be one of the things that people are integrating over and over again. And I think that parents and survivors have an opportunity to reevaluate their relationship with sex in a way that does feel really agentic and self-determined and consensual and thriving. And so it's a horrible impetus for this exploration. And also really taking the time to evaluate your relationship with desire and sexuality can be a part of what helps parents heal, which then makes them stronger supports for their child and their child's healing. So it's a really important and integral component of the family system's growth to think about how do we look at every domain of impact in our lives, including sex.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That was one of the big takeaways, is that like when this happens, the whole family system is affected.
Yeah.
And how do we take care of the whole family system?
Totally, totally. Well, thank you for doing this research. It's groundbreaking, long overdue, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you do with it, if you write a book or if you create some sort of resources for parents, because definitely this is a place where they can get stuck. And if people want to work with you, of course, they can schedule a time to have a consultation with you and get started. And is there anything else you'd like people to know about this research or about how parents can do their own healing?
I think just the biggest thing, like I said, is just acknowledging that everybody in this family system is impacted when something like this happens, and it's important to take care of yourself. And it's okay to take time and seek out support for your own self in addition to being there for your kid.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Reynolds, and congratulations on completing your doctorate with this research.
Thank you.
That's our time today. Thank you for joining me and for showing up for yourself. Before we go, a gentle reminder. This podcast is for education and exploration. It's not a substitute for clinical care. If you're ready for more personalized support, my team and I at Modern Intimacy offer free consultations to help you figure out what that could look like. You can go to modernintimacy.com or find the link in the show notes. Until next time, keep getting smarter, getting closer, and getting naked in all the ways that matter to you.